The key didn't fit. I stood on the front porch of my father's house, my fingers trembling around the metal, trying again like maybe I'd made a mistake, like maybe grief had made my hands clumsy. The Arizona sun burned down on the back of my neck, and sweat trickled along my spine beneath my black funeral dress. I pushed the key into the lock again. It scraped, stopped, refused to turn. That wasn't possible. I had used this key every single day for years. I had unlocked this door in the early mornings to check on my father's medication, in the afternoons to cook his meals, in the evenings to make sure he wasn't alone. My heart began to pound so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then I heard movement inside. Footsteps. Slow. Calm. Deliberate. The curtain beside the door shifted, and a shadow appeared behind the glass. And then I heard her voice. Cold. Sharp. Familiar. You don't live here anymore. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked into place as I slowly lifted my eyes toward the glass door. There she stood. Linda. My younger sister. Perfect hair. Perfect posture. Calm expression like she was greeting a delivery driver instead of her own sister who had just buried our father hours earlier. You have nothing now, she added. Her voice smooth. Almost bored. Dad left everything to me. Every last dollar. The words didn't make sense at first. Everything. Every dollar. Then she said the number. $39 million. And just like that, standing there in the brutal Arizona heat, I realized I had just been locked out of my own father's house, on the very day he died. The morning had started in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and quiet sorrow. I could still hear the soft beeping of the machines in my mind, even though they had gone silent hours earlier. I had been sitting beside my father's bed when his breathing slowed. His hand had rested in mine, thin and fragile, his skin cool but still alive with warmth. I remember watching his chest rise and fall, each breath weaker than the last. Then there was that final exhale. Long. Quiet. Permanent. The nurse stepped in gently, placing a hand on my shoulder as if words might shatter the moment. I remember staring at his face, waiting for movement that never came, waiting for another breath that never followed. I held his hand long after the machines were turned off, long after the doctor whispered the time of death, long after the room fell into stillness. I had cared for him every single day since my mother passed away 5 years earlier. I lived just 10 minutes from his house here in Scottsdale, Arizona, close enough to check on him every morning before work, close enough to stop by during lunch breaks, close enough to sit with him in the evenings so he wouldn't feel alone. I managed his medications, scheduled his doctor visits, cooked his meals, cleaned his house, made sure he never felt forgotten. Meanwhile, Linda lived in California. She visited maybe twice a year, sometimes less. When she did come, it was always dramatic. Expensive gifts, designer handbags for Dad that he never used, loud conversations about investments and success and how busy her life had become. She talked about money the way some people talked about weather. Constantly. Casually. Without warmth. I remember one afternoon about 6 months before Dad passed. Linda had called while I was helping him sort his medication into one of those weekly plastic containers. "Did you know Dad's portfolio has grown again?" she said, her voice bright with excitement. I glanced at my father, who sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching us both with tired eyes. "I didn't realize that mattered right now," I replied. Linda laughed lightly. "It always matters. Evelyn, money matters. Not family. Not time. Not presence. Money." After my father passed that morning, everything moved too quickly. Nurses came and went. Papers needed signing. Funeral arrangements had to begin. There were phone calls to make and decisions to finalize. And somehow, in the middle of all that grief and paperwork, Linda arrived. Too quickly. Too prepared. She walked into the hospital wearing a perfectly tailored black dress, her husband Robert trailing behind her with a leather briefcase in hand. Not flowers. Not tears. A briefcase. I remember staring at it, feeling an odd tightening in my chest that I couldn't quite explain at the time. "We need to take care of legal matters quickly," Linda said after offering a brief hug that felt more like a formality than comfort. Not once did she sit beside Dad's bed. Not once did she hold his hand. Not once did she cry. Instead, she made phone calls, spoke quietly with Robert in corners, checked documents, moved with the calm efficiency of someone handling a business transaction. Not the death of her father. By late afternoon, we returned to the house, or what I thought was still our house. I barely noticed the locksmith van parked along the curb at first. My mind was still foggy with exhaustion and grief. The air felt heavy, thick with heat and sadness. But when I stepped out of my car and saw a man kneeling at the front door with tools spread across the porch, something inside me tightened. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice weak from hours of crying. Linda didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't even look guilty. "Oh," she said casually, as if explaining something ordinary. "Just updating the locks." Updating. Like this was routine maintenance. Like replacing filters or fixing a loose hinge. I remember standing there, watching the locksmith remove the old lock and install a new one. The metallic clinking echoing louder than it should have. Every sound felt wrong. Every movement felt final. But I told myself it was temporary. That maybe there was an explanation. That maybe grief was clouding my judgment. So I left briefly to collect the certified death certificates from the funeral office across town. When I returned an hour later, the locksmith van was gone. The porch looked the same. The house looked the same. But everything had changed. Because when I walked up to the door, reached into my purse, and pulled out my key, it no longer worked. Linda appeared behind the glass moments later, her expression calm, almost satisfied. "You have nothing now," she said. Not loud. Not angry. Just certain. And when she closed the curtain in front of my face, blocking my view of the house I had walked into nearly every day for years. The silence outside felt heavier than any argument. I stood there alone in the driveway, holding my purse, my keys, and the unbearable weight of disbelief. That was when something surfaced in the back of my mind. A memory. Months earlier. Late evening. My father sitting at the kitchen table, his face serious in a way I rarely saw. He had handed me a sealed envelope, my name written across the front in his shaky handwriting. "Keep this safe," he told me quietly. "Don't open it unless you absolutely have to." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, standing outside that locked door in the Arizona heat, I realized something that sent a sudden jolt through my chest. That envelope wasn't inside the house. It was still safe, hidden, untouched. And for the first time since Linda shut me out of my own father's home, I realized I wasn't completely powerless. Not yet. I didn't knock on the door again. I didn't scream or pound my fists against the glass like some desperate stranger begging to be let inside. Instead, I stood there in the driveway, frozen, staring at the closed curtains as if they might suddenly open and undo what had just happened. They didn't. Across the street, I noticed Mrs. Callahan, our elderly neighbor, standing behind her window. She had known my father for years, brought him homemade cookies during Christmas, checked in on him when I couldn't make it over fast enough. Our eyes met for half a second. Then she slowly reached up and pulled her curtains shut. That small movement hurt more than anything Linda had said. Not just locked out. Erased. I turned back toward my car, my legs moving on instinct more than intention. I didn't remember opening the driver's door or sitting down. I just remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The Arizona sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. My funeral dress clung uncomfortably to my skin, still smelling faintly of hospital disinfectant and wilted flowers. I started the engine, but I didn't know where to go. Not home. Not anymore. I drove without direction, turning down streets I barely registered, my vision blurred by tears that refused to fully fall. The radio stayed silent. The air inside the car felt heavy, thick with grief and disbelief. After a few minutes, or maybe longer, I found myself pulling into an empty grocery store parking lot. I left the engine running. Just sat there, breathing, trying to understand how my life had changed so completely in a single afternoon. I reached for my phone, my hands still shaking. No missed calls, no messages, nothing from Linda, no apology, no explanation, just silence. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. For a moment, the world outside disappeared, replaced by the memory of my father's face earlier that morning. Pale, still, peaceful in a way that made the loss feel even more permanent. And then a name surfaced in my mind. Margaret Collins, my best friend for more than 20 years. The one person who had stood beside me through every major moment in my life. My mother's funeral, my father's diagnosis, countless quiet evenings when exhaustion and worry felt overwhelming. I stared at her name in my contacts list. My thumb hovered over the call button. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I truly had nowhere else to go. But I pressed the button anyway. Margaret answered on the first ring. Evelyn. Honey, how are you holding up? Her voice, warm, steady, familiar, broke something inside me. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. She locked me out. I finally whispered. Silence filled the line. What do you mean, locked you out? Margaret asked, her tone shifting instantly from concern to disbelief. I mean, she changed the locks, I said, my voice trembling. Linda changed the locks on Dad's house. She told me everything belongs to her. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Margaret spoke, her voice firm and protective. Get in your car and come here? Right now? I don't want to be a burden, I murmured weakly. You are not a burden, she said sharply. You're family, and you're not spending tonight alone after what she did. Those words settled over me like a blanket I didn't realize I needed. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my dress and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward Margaret's neighborhood. The drive felt endless, though it was only about 15 minutes. My thoughts spun wildly about my father, about Linda, about the house that now felt like forbidden territory. When I pulled into Margaret's driveway, her front door swung open before I even turned off the engine. She stepped outside, her face tight with worry. The moment I got out of the car, she wrapped her arms around me. And that was when the tears finally came. Not quiet tears. Not controlled ones. Heavy, shaking sobs that left me breathless. I cried for my father. For the house? For the years I had spent caring for him. For the feeling of being thrown away like I never mattered. Margaret didn't say much. She just held me until my breathing slowed and the sobs faded into shaky silence. Inside, her house smelled like chamomile tea and lavender candles, familiar scents that softened the sharp edges of the day. She guided me to the kitchen table and placed a warm mug in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it but didn't drink. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had left behind. My clothes are still there, I said quietly. Margaret frowned. Everything is there, I continued. My documents. Photos. Mom's jewelry. Dad's medical files. All of it. Locked away. Taken. Controlled. Margaret sat across from me, her expression growing more serious by the second. You need to talk to a lawyer, she said gently. That word, lawyer, landed like a stone in my chest. Lawyer. It made everything feel real in a way grief hadn't yet allowed. What if she's right? I whispered. Margaret leaned forward. What do you mean? What if Dad really left everything to her? I asked, my voice trembling again. What if I lost everything and didn't even know it? The fear settled deep in my stomach, heavy and cold. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We don't assume anything, she said firmly. We find out the truth. That night, after Margaret went to bed, I lay awake in her guest room staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's face behind the glass door, heard her voice repeating the same cruel words. You have nothing now. Hours passed in silence. Then suddenly, my eyes snapped open. My heart began pounding. Not from fear, from realization. The envelope. I sat upright in bed, the memory hitting me like a wave. I could see my father clearly in my mind, his tired eyes, his steady voice, the way his hands trembled slightly as he passed it to me. Keep this safe. He had said, don't open it unless you absolutely have to. I had followed his instructions carefully. The envelope wasn't inside the house. It wasn't locked behind Linda's new door. It was stored in my personal lockbox. Safe. Hidden. Untouched. A strange surge of energy moved through my chest. Small. Fragile. But undeniable. Hope. Then my phone vibrated suddenly on the nightstand. The sharp sound made me jump. I grabbed it quickly, my fingers trembling. A message flashed across the screen. From Linda. You need to stop causing problems. Everything is already settled. No mention of Dad. No sympathy. No humanity. Just control. Another message followed seconds later. You should start looking for a new place to live. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as anger replaced fear. Margaret appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the vibration. What happened? She asked. I handed her the phone. She read the messages slowly, her expression darkening. She's acting like she already owns everything, Margaret muttered. That sentence stayed with me long after she returned to bed, because the more I thought about it, the more something didn't make sense. Did I ever actually see the will? Did I ever read anything? Did anyone officially tell me what Dad had written? No. Everything Linda said was just words. Nothing signed. Nothing proven. Nothing official. I walked quietly into the living room and opened my purse, my fingers brushing against the small key attached to my keychain. The key to my lockbox. I held it tightly in my palm, feeling its cool metal edges press into my skin. If Dad left something for me, I whispered softly into the darkness, it's inside that envelope. And for the first time since Linda locked me out of my own father's house, I felt something I hadn't felt all day. Hope. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I sat alone at Margaret's dining table long after she had gone to bed, the soft ticking of the wall clock marking each passing second like a warning I couldn't ignore. The overhead light cast a pale glow across the table, illuminating the small metal lockbox sitting directly in front of me. It looked smaller than I remembered, simpler, harmless. But tonight, it felt heavy with meaning. My fingers hovered just above the lid, not touching, not opening, just waiting. A strange fear settled deep in my chest, tightening my throat. Not fear of Linda, not fear of losing the house. Something deeper than that. Fear of the truth. What if this envelope proved Linda right? What if my father had trusted her instead of me? What if everything I believed about our relationship had been nothing more than wishful thinking? I reached into my purse and pulled out the small brass key attached to my keychain. The metal felt cool against my fingertips, grounding me just enough to steady my shaking hands. Slowly, carefully, I inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I turned it. Click. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting something dramatic to happen, some sudden shift in the world around me. But nothing changed. The clock kept ticking. The house remained still. Inside the lockbox were familiar items. Insurance documents, old receipts, a few folded bank statements I had stored months earlier. And beneath them, the envelope, still sealed, still intact, still exactly as my father had handed it to me. I reached for it slowly, lifting it from the box as if it might break in my hands. The paper felt thick and slightly textured, the edges worn just enough to show age. My name was written across the front. Evelyn. His handwriting. Shaky. Uneven. Not the steady script I had known all my life. That detail alone sent a sharp ache through my chest. He had written this when he was already weak, already tired, already preparing. I swallowed hard. forcing myself to breathe evenly. Footsteps sounded softly behind me. I turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her robe wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "I heard the lock click," she said quietly. Her eyes moved from my face to the envelope in my hands. "Is that what he gave you?" I nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The air felt thick with anticipation. I studied the edges of the envelope more closely and noticed something I hadn't before. It wasn't sealed casually. Thick strips of tape covered the flap, layered carefully, deliberately. Not meant to be opened lightly. Not meant to be ignored. "He really didn't want anyone else opening this," Margaret whispered. I nodded again. Then, before my courage could fade, I tore through the tape. The ripping sound felt unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside were several folded documents. More than I expected. More than I was prepared for. My heart pounded harder as I slid the first sheet free. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter. Handwritten. Personal. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, smoothing it flat against the table. The ink looked slightly faded, but his handwriting was unmistakable. I began reading silently. "If you are reading this, it means something has already gone wrong." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Something has already gone wrong. My chest tightened as the meaning settled over me. He had expected trouble. Not hoped. Expected. I continued reading. His letter wasn't about money. It wasn't about property or assets or numbers. It was about trust. About responsibility. About fear, not of illness, but of conflict. "There are things your sister doesn't fully understand." He had written. That line sent a chill through my body. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes scanning the letter as I held it steady. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. But deep down, I felt something shift, a suspicion forming. I set the letter aside and pulled out the second document. This one looked different. Official. Typed. Structured. Legal language filled the page from top to bottom. At the very top sat the name of a law firm I didn't recognize. Not one I had ever heard my father mention. Not once. That realization alone made my stomach tighten. "Do you recognize that name?" Margaret asked. I shook my head. No. That answer felt heavier than it should have. Why hadn't he told me? Why keep this hidden? Margaret crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "You need someone professional to read that," she said. I nodded slowly, pulling the third item from the envelope. A simple card slipped into my hand. A business card. Plain. Clean. Minimal. Printed neatly across the front. Attorney Daniel Reeves. A direct phone number beneath his name. I turned the card over slowly and froze. Written in my father's handwriting across the back were 4 simple words. Call him. Only him. Not optional. Not a suggestion. An instruction. Margaret exhaled quietly. "This was planned," she murmured. Her voice carried a mix of concern and awe. I sat back in my chair, staring at the document spread across the table. My mind raced, connecting pieces I hadn't understood before. My father hadn't acted randomly. He hadn't guessed. He had prepared, carefully, quietly, years before this moment. For the first time since standing outside that locked door, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not victory. Clarity. A fragile but undeniable sense of direction. Then my phone vibrated suddenly on the table. The sharp sound made me flinch. Margaret looked at me immediately. "Who is it?" I turned the phone toward myself. "Linda." Another message. Short. Cold. "You need to stop interfering. The estate is already mine." The word mine glowed on the screen like a warning. Possessive. Confident. Too confident. Margaret read over my shoulder, her lips pressing into a thin line. "She's acting like everything's finished," she said quietly. That observation settled heavily in my mind. Everything she had claimed had been verbal, not official, not documented, not proven. I looked down at the business card again, my fingers tracing the printed letters of Attorney Reeves's name. Margaret spoke softly beside me. "Did you ever actually see the will?" I froze, thinking, replaying every conversation from the past few days, every moment after my father died. And suddenly, the answer became painfully clear. No, I hadn't. Not once. Not ever. Everything Linda said was just words. Nothing signed. Nothing witnessed. Nothing confirmed. I picked up the business card again, holding it tightly between my fingers. Morning light was beginning to creep faintly through the curtains, signaling the start of a new day. A new fight. Margaret placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "You need answers," she said. "Not guesses. Not assumptions. Answers." I took a slow breath and reached for my phone. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the number printed on the card. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a calm male voice answered. "This is Attorney Daniel Reeves." I swallowed hard, steadying my voice. "My father told me to call you if something went wrong." There was a pause, longer than expected. Then he spoke again. "I was wondering when you would..." And in that moment, I realized my father hadn't just prepared documents. He had prepared a plan. "I was expecting your call sooner, but I'm glad you called now." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that didn't rush or panic. But something in his tone made my stomach tighten. Not surprise, not confusion. Recognition. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment. I glanced at Margaret, who stood beside me with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched my face carefully, trying to read the conversation through my expression alone. "Are you somewhere safe right now?" Attorney Reeves asked. Safe. That word hit harder than I expected. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how unsafe I had felt standing outside that locked door, staring at my own home from the outside like a stranger. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm staying with a friend." "Good," he replied. "Has your sister contacted you since yesterday?" "Not, did she?" "Has she?" Like he already expected the answer. "Yes," I said. "She's been sending messages." There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "I'd like to meet with you in person," he said finally. "As soon as possible." I blinked. "How soon?" "This morning." I looked at the clock on Margaret's wall. Barely past 7. "That soon?" I asked. "Yes," he said calmly. "Bring the envelope and every document your father gave you. And do not share copies with anyone." "Not yet." The warning in his voice sent a chill down my spine. Not share copies. Not yet. Something about this situation was bigger than I understood. "I'll be there," I said. When I ended the call, Margaret leaned forward immediately. "What did he say?" "He wants to meet this morning," I replied. "Right away." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That was fast. Too fast. That thought lingered in my mind as we gathered my things and headed toward the car. The drive across Scottsdale felt shorter than usual, though the tension inside my chest made every traffic light feel like an obstacle. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur past, wondering how my life had changed so completely in less than 24 hours. The law office building stood tall and modern against the bright Arizona sky. Glass panels reflected sunlight in sharp angles that made me squint as we approached the entrance. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on my back. "You're not alone," she whispered. Inside, the reception area was quiet and immaculate. Soft lighting, polished floors, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. I stepped up to the desk. "Good morning," the receptionist said with a polite smile. "Name?" "Evelyn Parker," I replied. She didn't hesitate. Her smile shifted into recognition. "Mr. Reeves is expecting you," she said immediately. Expecting, not surprised, not checking. Expecting. That word made my pulse quicken. Margaret leaned closer to me as we followed the receptionist down the hallway. "He knew you were coming," she whispered. "Yes, he did." The door at the end of the hallway opened before we reached it. Attorney Daniel Reeves stepped out. He looked to be in his mid-60s, dressed in a dark suit that fit him perfectly. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate. His eyes were sharp, observant, not warm, but steady, reliable. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Ms. Parker," he said gently. I nodded. "Thank you." Then he added something that made my breath catch. "And I'm sorry for what your sister has done." I froze. "You already know?" I asked quietly. He gave a slight nod. "Your father shared his concerns with me some time ago." That sentence changed everything. Some time ago? Not yesterday. Not recently. Long before this moment. We stepped into his office, and he gestured for us to sit. "May I see the envelope?" he asked. I handed it to him carefully, my hands still trembling slightly. He opened it slowly, reviewing each document with precise attention. The room fell completely silent except for the faint rustle of paper. Margaret sat beside me, barely moving. Reeves paused at one page longer than expected. My heart began to pound. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at me. "Did your sister claim everything belongs to her?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "She said Dad left everything to her." He nodded once, slowly, then said something that made my entire body stiffen. "There is no scenario where your sister legally owns everything." The words echoed in my mind. No scenario. Legally. Everything. Relief washed over me. But confusion followed immediately behind it. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "In fact," he continued, "most of your father's estate is not even controlled by the will." Margaret leaned forward instantly. "What does control it?" she asked. Reeves folded his hands neatly on the desk. "A private trust." The words settled into the air between us. Heavy. Unfamiliar? I stared at him. "A trust," I repeated. "Yes," he said calmly. "The majority of your father's wealth, including the estimated $39 million, was placed into a private trust several years ago." Several years? Not recently. Not after his illness. Before, strategically. I didn't know anything about that. I whispered. "I'm aware," Reeves replied. That answer sent a chill through me. He wasn't surprised by my confusion. He expected it. Margaret shook her head slowly. "So Linda doesn't actually control the estate." Reeves gave a measured response. "Not without authorization." Authorization? From whom? That question formed in my mind instantly. He glanced down at another page in the folder, flipping it carefully. "Did your sister provide you with any official documentation?" he asked. "No," I answered. "Just words." He nodded again, slower this time. "If she changed the locks without proper authority," he said carefully, "she may have created legal complications for herself." Complications. That word carried weight. Possibility. Risk. Hope. For the first time, Linda didn't feel invincible. She felt reckless. Reeves flipped to another document, studying it closely before looking up at me again. "Did your father ever discuss responsibility with you?" he asked. "Not money. Responsibility." That word echoed strangely in my mind. I searched my memory, replaying conversations from months before his death. Small comments. Quiet moments. Things I hadn't understood at the time. He said things, I admitted. Little things I didn't think much about. Reeves nodded, almost satisfied. "That makes sense." He closed the folder briefly, resting his hand on top of it. "If your sister believes she controls the estate," he said carefully, "she may take further actions." "What kind of actions?" Margaret asked. "Moving assets, selling property, making financial decisions she doesn't legally have the authority to make." That possibility made my chest tighten. Danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. Reeves looked at me again, his expression steady. "From this moment forward," he said firmly, "document everything." Every word felt deliberate, Important. Strategic. He opened the folder one last time and turned it slowly toward me. His finger rested on a single line. "This," he said quietly, "is where everything changes." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the document. And there it was. My name, printed clearly, officially, permanently. And as I stared at that page, something deep inside me shifted. My father hadn't left me helpless. He had left me in charge. "You were appointed as the primary trustee." The words settled into the room like a weight I couldn't yet lift. I stared at the document in front of me. My name printed in neat, official letters that didn't look like they belonged to my life. My eyes moved across the page, scanning the unfamiliar legal language, but none of it made sense at first. Not fully, not clearly. "What does that mean?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. Not weak, just overwhelmed. Attorney Reeves leaned forward slightly, resting his hands calmly on the desk. "It means your father trusted you with the responsibility of managing the trust," he explained. "Not just receiving money. Controlling it. Protecting it. Protecting it." The word echoed in my mind. Margaret shifted beside me, her posture tightening as she listened. "So, she's in charge?" Margaret asked carefully. Reeves nodded once. "Yes. As trustee, Evelyn holds the authority to oversee the assets placed within the trust. That includes property, investments, and financial accounts. Authority." The word didn't feel empowering. It felt heavy, like something placed directly into my hands whether I felt ready or not. "This wasn't an accident," Reeves continued. "Your father made this decision deliberately." He reached into the folder and pulled out another sheet of paper. "This section outlines his reasoning." My heart pounded harder as he slid the document across the desk. I leaned forward slowly, reading the typed words line by line. My father's explanation. Formal. Precise. Recorded permanently. "He wrote this years ago," Reeves said quietly. "Years. Not days. Not months. Years." My throat tightened as I continued reading. He listed my name first, describing me as dependable, consistent, reliable. The words blurred slightly as emotions swelled inside my chest. I remembered mornings spent at his kitchen table, helping him sort his medications into labeled containers, afternoons driving him to appointments, evenings cooking meals while he watched television from his favorite chair. Small routines, quiet sacrifices, things no one else saw, things Linda never witnessed. He noted your daily involvement in his care. Reeves added, "Your reliability gave him confidence." Confidence. That word struck deeper than anything else. For years, I had wondered if my efforts mattered, if anyone truly noticed. Now I knew. He had. Every single day? Margaret wiped quietly at the corner of her eye, though she tried to hide it. "You earned that," she murmured softly. I swallowed hard and turned to the next section. "Your sister is not excluded," Reeves continued carefully. That caught my attention immediately. Linda wasn't completely removed. Just limited? She is listed as a secondary beneficiary, Reeves explained. Her portion is defined and controlled. Not open-ended. Controlled. That word felt significant, meaningful. Linda had not been given authority, only access, and only under specific conditions. "So she can't just take control?" Margaret asked. "No," Reeves replied firmly. "Without trustee authorization. She has no legal authority to manage the assets." Which meant, without me. The realization hit slowly but powerfully. Everything Linda claimed, everything she insisted, was assumption, not law, not truth. Reeves flipped another page and looked directly at me again. "Did your sister physically change the locks on the property?" "Yes," I answered. The memory still stung. Standing outside my own home, key useless in my hand, door closed in my face. Reeves exhaled quietly, his expression tightening. That decision may have created legal exposure for her. Exposure. A word that suggested consequences. Risk. Mistake. Margaret leaned forward immediately. You mean she could get into trouble? If she acted without legal authority, Reeves said carefully. Yes. Potentially. That answer changed the emotional balance inside the room. For the first time, Linda didn't feel untouchable. She felt reckless. Reeves turned to another document. This trust currently holds assets estimated at approximately $39 million, he said calmly. The number hit me again. Harder this time. Not rumor. Not speculation. Reality. $39 million. Investments. Properties. Financial accounts. Everything my father had built over decades. But Reeves quickly added something that shifted my thinking. This is not money to spend freely, he said. This is money to protect. Protect. Not enjoy. Not celebrate. Protect. Responsibility settled deeper into my chest. Margaret remained silent, watching my face carefully. You didn't ask for this, she whispered. No, I said quietly. But he chose me. That realization steadied me. Reeves leaned back slightly in his chair. When did your sister begin acting as if she controlled the estate? He asked. I thought carefully, replaying events from the moment Dad passed. Immediately, I said. She arrived with documents. She spoke to people before the funeral arrangements were even finalized. Reeves nodded slowly. That speed is significant. Why? Margaret asked. Because it suggests assumption, Reeves replied. Possibly even overconfidence. Overconfidence. That word fit Linda perfectly. Too confident. Too fast. Too sure of victory. Reeves continued reviewing documents, his movements calm and deliberate. This trust was created several years ago, he explained. Not during your father's illness. Not under pressure. Years. Meaning he had time to think. Time to plan. Time to prepare. My father hadn't reacted emotionally. He had acted strategically. That realization filled me with a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. He knew. He saw something coming, and he prepared me for it. You are now legally responsible for protecting the trust, Reeves said. The words landed heavily. Responsibility. Not reward. Not privilege. Duty. Margaret nodded quietly beside me. You can do this, she whispered. Reeves continued. There will be a formal reading of the will in 4 days. 4 days. A countdown. A deadline. And your sister will be present, he added. Of course she would. Linda would arrive confident. Certain. Prepared to claim victory. But this time, I wouldn't be standing outside the door. This time, I would walk into the room with knowledge she didn't have. With authority she didn't expect. With responsibility my father trusted me to carry. As I gathered the documents carefully into my hands, the weight of them felt heavier than paper alone. Because I wasn't walking out of that office as a victim anymore. I was walking out as the person responsible for protecting everything my father had built. And for the first time since the day he died, I realized something quietly powerful. I wasn't powerless anymore. But neither was the danger. My phone vibrated just as I finished reviewing the documents Attorney Reeves had given me. The sound made my shoulders tense instantly. Margaret looked up from across the kitchen table, her expression already cautious. The morning sunlight spilled through her window, lighting the stack of legal papers in front of me. But nothing about the moment felt calm. I picked up the phone slowly. Linda. Her name glowed across the screen like a warning. Not a text this time. A call. The first direct call since she locked me out of the house. Margaret watched silently as my thumb hovered above the screen. You don't have to answer, she said softly. But I did. I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear. Hello? I said. Linda didn't greet me. Didn't ask how I was. Didn't mention Dad. Her voice came sharp and fast, filled with irritation. You've been talking to lawyers. Haven't you? The accusation landed like a slap. I stayed silent for a second, choosing my words carefully. Yes, I said calmly. That one word shifted something immediately. Linda let out a sharp breath. I knew it. she snapped. You're trying to cause problems when everything is already settled. Settled. That word again. So confident. So absolute. I glanced at Margaret, who was listening closely, her jaw tightening. Nothing is settled, I replied quietly. Not legally. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Short, but heavy. Then Linda laughed. A dry, mocking sound. Oh, please, she said. I changed the locks because it's my house now. I'm handling everything. Like I always should have. My house. The possessiveness in her voice felt deliberate. Calculated. You don't legally own the estate, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Silence. This time longer. More uncomfortable. Then another laugh. Forced. Too loud. That's ridiculous, she snapped. I've already spoken to my lawyer. Everything belongs to me. My grip tightened around the phone. That's not what I was told, I replied. Her breathing became louder, sharper, more emotional, less controlled. Then she said something that made my heart stop. I already moved some of Dad's investment funds, she blurted. The words hit like a thunderclap. For a second, I couldn't speak. Margaret's eyes widened across the table, her mouth parting slightly in shock. Linda kept talking, unaware of what she had just revealed. I had to take care of things before you made everything complicated, she continued quickly. But it was too late. She had already said it. Moved funds. Without authorization. Without confirmation. Without permission. I stayed silent, letting the quiet stretch between us, letting the weight of her own words settle into the space. What? She demanded sharply. Why aren't you saying anything? Still, I said nothing. Finally, she spoke again, her voice lower now, more cautious. Just stay out of this. Evelyn, she warned. You don't understand what you're doing. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my hands trembling. Margaret leaned forward immediately. She moved funds, she whispered. That's what she said, I replied. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. That sounds illegal. The word hung in the air. Illegal. Dangerous. Serious. Without wasting another second, I reached for the number Attorney Reeves had given me and dialed it. He answered quickly. Reeves speaking. It's Evelyn, I said. Linda just called me. Tell me exactly what she said. He replied calmly, word for word. I repeated the conversation, my voice steady despite the anxiety building inside my chest. There was a long pause after I finished, long enough to make my pulse race. Then Reeves spoke again. That may be the most important statement she could have made. Important. Not shocking. Not surprising. Important. What do you mean? I asked. If funds were moved without trustee authorization, he explained, it may constitute a violation of fiduciary law. The legal word sounded heavy, complicated, dangerous. So, she made a mistake, Margaret asked quietly from beside me. A significant one, Reeves replied. That answer shifted something inside me. For the first time, Linda didn't seem powerful. She seemed reckless. From this moment forward, Reeves continued, you must document everything. Every message. Every call. Every interaction. I understand, I said. Do not confront her directly without legal guidance, he added. And save every piece of communication she sends. I will. After the call ended, the kitchen felt unusually quiet. Margaret let out a slow breath. Your father saw this coming, she murmured. Her words triggered a memory, one I hadn't thought about in months. I saw my father sitting at the dining table, papers spread in front of him, his expression serious, his eyes focused in a way that suggested deep concern. Sometimes the loudest people, he had told me quietly, are the ones hiding the most fear. At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, I did. Linda's confidence, her arrogance, her need to control. It wasn't strength. It was fear. Later that afternoon, My phone vibrated again. Another message. From Linda. If you keep interfering, you'll regret it. The threat was unmistakable. Clear. Direct. Margaret read it over my shoulder. She's escalating, she said quietly. I nodded. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. Control. Dominance. That night, after dinner, I sat alone in the living room, rereading my father's handwritten letter. Carefully. Slowly. One line stood out more than the others. Trust your instincts, even when others doubt you. I read that sentence again, and again, until its meaning settled deep inside my chest. My instincts told me something was wrong, that Linda had acted too quickly, too aggressively, too recklessly. The television played softly in the background, a local news station murmuring through routine headlines. Margaret suddenly reached for the remote and raised the volume. Wait, she said sharply. I looked up. On the screen, a financial news segment flashed across the bottom of the broadcast. Text scrolled across the screen, words moving quickly. But one phrase caught my attention immediately. Unusual withdrawal activity flagged. My heart skipped. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Listen, she whispered. The reporter continued speaking, explaining that a large financial movement connected to a local estate had triggered institutional review protocols. Estate. Local. Large withdrawal. My pulse began racing. Then the account number appeared briefly on the screen. Not the full number, just the last few digits, but they looked familiar. Too familiar. My breath caught in my throat. What did she do? I whispered. And as the news segment replayed those numbers again, a terrifying realization settled deep in my chest. Linda hadn't just made a mistake. She had crossed a line she couldn't take back. The television kept repeating the report. The same scrolling numbers sliding across the bottom of the screen like a warning I couldn't ignore. Margaret didn't lower the volume this time. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes locked on the screen while the reporter calmly repeated phrases that felt anything but calm. Unusual withdrawal activity, under review, financial institution monitoring. Each word tightened the knot already forming in my chest. I stared harder, trying to memorize the partial account number that flashed briefly again. The last digits looked hauntingly familiar, numbers I had seen before while helping Dad organize paperwork late at night. Margaret turned to me slowly. Do you think that was her? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but the fear underneath it was unmistakable. I don't know, I whispered. But deep down, I suspected the truth. Without hesitation, I reached for my phone and called Attorney Reeves again. He answered almost immediately. Reeves speaking. It's Evelyn, I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. We just saw a news report about suspicious withdrawals from an estate account. There was a pause. Not confusion. Not surprise. Just quiet confirmation. I see, he said calmly. You don't sound shocked, I replied. I'm not, he answered. If funds were accessed improperly, financial institutions would flag the activity. Flag. That word landed heavily again. Official. Documented. Serious. So it could be her? Margaret asked, leaning closer to the phone. It is possible, Reeves said carefully. Especially if the timing aligns with your sister's recent statements. My stomach tightened. Linda had moved quickly. Too quickly. She didn't wait. Reeves continued. That kind of urgency often creates mistakes. Mistakes. Dangerous ones. He reminded me again about the reading of the will. 4 days, he said. We stay patient until then. 4 days suddenly felt much longer than they had before. When the call ended, the silence in Margaret's living room felt heavier than before. But it didn't stay silent for long. My phone began ringing. Again. And again. Different names flashed across the screen. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Some in years. Margaret glanced at the screen. They're hearing things, she said quietly. I answered the first call reluctantly. It was my cousin Denise. Evelyn. She began carefully. We heard Linda is handling everything now. Handling everything. The phrase sounded too familiar. Who told you that? I asked. Linda mentioned it. Denise admitted. She said Dad left everything to her. Of course she did. She was shaping the story. Controlling the narrative. Another call came minutes later. Then another. Each conversation carried the same tone, curiosity mixed with quiet judgment. One relative whispered something that stung deeper than the others. I'm sorry you didn't get much. Didn't get much. They assumed. Everyone assumed. No one asked. Margaret sat beside me, her expression tightening with each conversation. They believe her, she muttered. Yes, they did. That realization hurt more than I expected. Later that afternoon, Margaret handed me her tablet without saying a word. What is it? I asked. Look. On the screen was a social media post. Linda's profile, posted less than an hour earlier. A photograph filled the screen. Linda stood inside the living room of my father's house. My father's chair sat behind her. His lamp, his books. Everything exactly where I had left it. Except now, she stood there like she owned it. Smiling. Relaxed. Confident. The caption beneath the photo read, "Taking care of family responsibilities." Carefully worded. Strategic. Manipulative. Margaret let out a sharp breath. That's unbelievable. I stared at the image longer than I should have. She looked completely comfortable. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't locked her own sister out just days earlier. Like she had already won. That arrogance settled into my chest like fuel. Not anger. Not yet. Resolve? Later that evening, I drove past the house. Not to stop. Not to confront. Just to see it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood streets I had traveled countless times over the years. As I slowed the car, my chest tightened. The curtains were drawn. Lights glowed inside. Movement flickered through the windows. People inside, living inside, occupying space that once felt like mine. I remembered mornings when Dad sat in his chair reading the newspaper while I prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of coffee. The quiet comfort of routine. Now, all of it felt distant. Foreign. As I drove slowly past, I noticed something new. A delivery truck parked near the driveway. Boxes being carried inside. More possessions. More territory claimed. Linda was settling in. Not temporarily. Permanently. The sight tightened something inside my chest. But this time, the feeling wasn't helplessness. It was determination. Back at Margaret's house, the evening felt quieter. Margaret prepared dinner, moving slowly around the kitchen while I sat at the table, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. Are you ready to see her again? The question caught me off guard. At the will reading, she added. I paused, thinking, remembering. Memories surfaced unexpectedly, childhood dinners, family gatherings, quiet comparisons between Linda and me. I remembered how Dad used to praise Linda's achievements loudly at the dinner table. Her awards, her successes, her confidence. And I remembered sitting quietly, waiting for acknowledgement that rarely came. Invisible. Unnoticed. For years. But that changed later. After Mom died. After illness settled into Dad's life. After responsibility shifted onto my shoulders. He saw me then. Not as background. Not as invisible. As dependable. As strong. That realization softened something inside me. Not bitterness. Understanding. Later that night, Attorney Reeves sent a reminder confirming the time and location of the will reading. Attendance would include extended family members. Not just Linda and me. More witnesses. More eyes. More judgment. Margaret helped me select clothing for the day. Simple. Professional. Not flashy. Not weak. Armor. That was what it felt like. Armor for battle. Before heading to bed, my phone vibrated one last time. Another message from Linda. Short. Sharp. Don't embarrass yourself at the reading. I stared at the screen, reading the words twice. Margaret leaned over to read it. Then she shook her head slowly. "She's nervous," she whispered. The idea surprised me. Linda. Nervous. Behind the arrogance. Behind the confidence. Fear. That possibility shifted everything. Morning arrived quickly. Too quickly. Sunlight spilled into Margaret's guest room, illuminating the quiet space as I stood in front of the mirror. Dressed. Prepared. Steady. Not fearless. But ready. I stared at my reflection. Not the woman who had stood helpless outside her locked home. Not the daughter left behind. The trustee. The protector. The one my father trusted. My phone vibrated again. A message from Attorney Reeves. "We're ready." Linda is already here. I stared at the screen for several seconds before slipping the phone into my purse. Then I took a slow breath. Deep. Steady. As I stepped toward the front door, I realized something that settled heavily into my chest. The next time I saw my sister, nothing between us would ever be the same again. The glass doors reflected the morning sun so brightly I had to squint before stepping inside. For a moment, I stood there, hand resting lightly on the handle, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this morning pressing against my chest. 4 days earlier, I had stood outside my own father's house, locked out like a stranger. Today, I was walking into a room where the truth would finally be spoken out loud. Margaret squeezed my hand once. "You're ready," she whispered. I nodded, though my heart was pounding so loudly I could feel it in my throat. We stepped inside. The air in the conference room felt heavy, crowded with tension and expectation. Conversations filled the space in low murmurs, quiet whispers between relatives who had gathered earlier than I had. Then, one by one, the whispers stopped. Heads turned. Eyes followed me as I entered. Some curious, some sympathetic, some openly judgmental. I could feel every stare like a weight pressing against my shoulders. Linda was already seated at the long, polished table. Of course she was. Perfect posture. Perfect outfit. Perfect confidence. She sat like someone who had already claimed victory. When her eyes met mine, a slow smile formed across her face. Not warm, not welcoming. Cold. Satisfied. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," she said softly. Her voice carried just far enough for the nearby relatives to hear. A few of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not publicly. Instead, I walked past her and took the seat Attorney Reeves had reserved for me. Margaret sat beside me, her presence steady and reassuring. Around the table, familiar faces filled the room, cousins, distant relatives, even a few people I hadn't seen in years. Most of them had barely visited during Dad's illness. But now they were here. For answers. For money. For inheritance. One relative leaned toward me quietly. "I'm sorry you didn't get much," she whispered. The assumption stung more than I expected. Didn't get much. Everyone believed Linda. Everyone believed her version of the story. Margaret stiffened beside me. But I stayed silent. Then the door opened. Attorney Reeves entered. The room fell quiet immediately. He moved calmly, placing a thick folder on the table before taking his seat at the head. His expression remained steady, professional, controlled. "Thank you all for attending," he began. His voice carried clearly across the room. "First, I want to acknowledge the passing of Mr. Robert Parker. He was a respected man, and this is a difficult time for everyone involved." Linda shifted slightly in her chair, sitting straighter, her confidence growing as the formal reading began. Reeves opened the folder slowly. Paper slid softly against paper. The sound felt louder than it should have. He began reading. At first, the details were simple. Personal belongings, furniture, family keepsakes, items assigned to various relatives. Predictable. Routine. Normal. Linda leaned back slightly in her chair, looking almost bored. Waiting. Confident. Certain her moment was coming. Minutes passed. The room remained silent except for Reeves's steady voice. Then he paused. Longer than expected. Linda leaned forward slightly. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Small, subtle, but noticeable. Reeves looked up from the page. Directly at Linda. Did you review this document carefully before making assumptions? He asked. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of confusion spread across the room. Linda frowned. What do you mean? She asked sharply. Reeves returned his gaze to the document. Then he continued reading. A majority of the estate assets are held within a private trust. Whispers erupted immediately. Soft gasps filled the air. Linda's confident smile began to fade. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her posture stiffened. What trust? She demanded quietly. Reeves did not answer her directly. Instead, he continued reading, his voice calm and unwavering. This trust holds the primary financial assets, including investments, property interests, and liquid funds. The room grew restless. Relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Linda leaned forward now, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The certainty in her face had begun to crack. Then Reeves spoke my name. Clearly. Formally, Evelyn Parker has been appointed primary trustee and principal beneficiary of the trust. The words echoed through the room like thunder. Silence followed. Heavy. Total. Then came the reactions. Soft gasps. Sharp whispers. Shock spreading across every face in the room. Linda froze completely. Her expression drained of color. Her lips parted slightly. But no words came out. Finally, she whispered. That's not possible. But it was. Everyone in that room knew it. Reeves continued reading. Explaining Linda's portion, defined, limited. Controlled, but I barely heard the details. My pulse slowed gradually. Steadying for the first time in days. Margaret reached for my hand beneath the table and squeezed it tightly. I didn't smile. Didn't react. Didn't celebrate. Instead, I sat quietly, absorbing the moment, remembering my father, his steady hands, his quiet voice, his careful planning. He hadn't left chaos behind. He had left protection. He had left certainty. He had left trust. Linda shifted beside me, her breathing uneven now. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared down at the papers in front of her. The woman who had locked me out of my own home now sat silent, defeated not by revenge but by preparation, by truth. Reeves closed the folder slowly. The trust structure remains intact. He concluded, all decisions moving forward will be managed by the appointed trustee. He glanced toward me briefly. Authority settled across my shoulders like a quiet weight. Not heavy, not crushing, just steady. I finally turned my head and looked at Linda. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity, with boundaries, with understanding. She avoided my gaze. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. As the room slowly emptied and relatives began whispering among themselves, I remained seated, letting the silence settle inside me. I remembered my father's final days, the quiet evenings, the careful instructions, the envelope he had placed into my hands months before his death. He hadn't just left money. He had left protection, preparation, faith. And in that moment, I realized something deeper than victory. Justice doesn't always come from revenge. Sometimes it comes from patience, from preparation, from trusting the truth to rise when the time is right. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in your own family, if you've ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or told you didn't matter, then you understand exactly what this moment feels like. And if this story reminds you of something from your own life, I'd really like to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you've ever faced a moment where the truth finally came out when you least expected it. And if stories like this speak to you, stories about standing your ground, protecting your dignity, and finding strength when everything feels lost, stay here with us. Subscribe to the channel, and keep listening. Because sometimes, Hearing someone else's story reminds us that our own strength has been there all along.